governments. So it's very complicated. The second part I can't remember. But the first is fine. So you will explain what it is. It's something new. But before giving floor to our speaker, I would like shortly to introduce with our guest. So our guest is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. So his main responsibility is public affairs and public diplomacy. Prior to that, Mr. Boijera was also involved in think tank community, working in several think tanks. As well, part of his responsibility was also work in The Hague as a law clerk to the president of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in very many other positions. Your CV was so impressive, I was ready actually to read it, but in the end I was thinking that there will be no left time for our discussion, so I decided to cut it short. So thank you very much for coming and deciding to share your thoughts with our students. So please, floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming here today. Can you hear me okay, or do I need to use the microphone? Is it okay?
Use my microphone if you wish as well. So it's up to you.
Prefer not to, but if folks can't hear me, I'll turn it on, and I'll try without it, and if you need me to use it, I'll switch to it. But thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today and to talk about the State Department's approach to social media and social networking, I think during a time of tremendous change in the world. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs for our European and Eurasian Affairs Bureau, I'm responsible for understanding how public diplomacy works within the European context, for engaging with European audiences, developing strategies for helping our people connect, and ensuring that public diplomacy considerations are taken into consideration in foreign policy formulation. Public diplomacy has traditionally been about exchange programs, connecting people, allowing them to experience connecting with their foreign counterparts, study each other's societies in depth, and experience them firsthand, and learn about others' cultures through print and broadcast media and cultural presentations. But as you know, in today's world, more and more interaction is virtual, and more information is available online. People are building bridges in their own societies and across the globe through new technologies. My responsibilities for shaping communication and enhancing engagement with Europe converge in a real fascinating way, I think, through the phenomenon of social media. The communications revolution, I think, has had an impact on the attitudes and aspirations of people everywhere. Just think about the recent events in North Africa and the Middle East, and how social media was the key means of communication for protesters. Social media users have played a leading role in the drama unfolding in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, Yemen and Syria, and the internet is serving as a catalyst for journalists and citizens, giving them a voice for ideas of positive change in their societies. The spread of social media is expanding access to reporting and information. It's redefining how people relate to each other and to their governments. As these functions are the core of public diplomacy, we have to work hard to make sure that these tools are used to serve interests of mutual understanding, and have to ensure that the policy environment enables and encourages social media to flourish. So, before going any further, let me talk a little bit more broadly about the top policy challenges that we see that are posed by social media. And I think that these challenges were laid out very well by Secretary Clinton in her Internet Freedom speech earlier this year, building on her groundbreaking Internet Freedom speech of January 2010. And I think that it's kind of good to start a little bit here because of the fact that it captures how we view the importance of advancing internet freedom and social media freedom that are made possible by new technologies, and I think provide a useful framework for understanding how we evaluate developments occurring across the world. The first of these challenges is maximizing liberty and security. It's worth noting that The Secretary in her remarks didn't say balancing, which is a term we often hear. The difference is that liberty and security are often presented as equal and opposite. You know, the more you have of one, the less you have of the other. But they actually, I think, make each other possible. Without security, liberty is fragile. Without liberty, security can be oppressive. The challenge we all face is finding the proper measure of security to enable our freedoms, but not so much or so little as to endanger them. Finding that measure is particularly important because of the qualities that make the internet a tool for extraordinary progress in terms of the speed at which we communicate these days, as well as the broad reach that the internet gives us. But you know, it also enables terrible wrongdoing. The spread of child pornography occurs online. Human trafficking is often furthered through internet connections. Those who engage in terrorism, terrorist networks, are able to organize online. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a tool, but can be used for great good or great evil. The second challenge is protecting transparency and confidentiality. Consent of the governed can only be meaningful if citizens understand the workings of their governments. Our core principle of government openness and information disclosure therefore extends to channels online. But in addition to being a public space, the internet is also a channel for private communications. And governments must protect privacy and confidentiality in order to provide for citizen security. In our foreign policy, the work of negotiating agreements, promoting the cause of human rights and democracy around the world would be terribly crippled if we had to make public every step of our efforts. And I'm sure you all saw this debate play out very publicly over the past year because of WikiLeaks. I think the third challenge, again, that Secretary Clinton laid out, which is important for our discussion, is protecting free expression while fostering tolerance and civility. As the Secretary observed, despite the fact that the internet provides a unique space for people to bridge their differences and build trust and understanding, the internet can also spread intolerant speech, which is amplified on the internet and often impossible to retract. This is especially true in the case of social media, which makes ideas and arguments easy to spread and access easier for people to have, to an extent I think that was unimaginable even a decade ago. So as the United States government, we don't have the answers, obviously, to all of these challenges, but actively work with our European allies, including Latvia, to address these without constricting the concepts of freedom of openness of the internet and the freedom of connectivity. We track terrorists and other criminals online. We attempt to make our government processes as open as possible without putting our work or other people's lives at risk. And we expose and try to bring to the light of day hateful speech where we think it tends to wither, and combat it with more speech in open debate, and so on. So bottom line is that despite these challenges, we try to address them the best we can without trying to curtail or curb the freedom of the internet. Our guiding principle is that we firmly believe in the freedom of expression, assembly, and association, which, again, we call the freedom to connect. We believe that the more freely information flows, the stronger societies become, and that access to information helps citizens hold governments accountable, generates ideas, and encourages creativity and entrepreneurship. So turning to the specific events of 2011, and as we analyze the rapid developments in North Africa and Middle East, what can we make out of it, and how does it tie into our broader approach to internet freedom and the freedom to connect? While there are a lot of different theories about how things transpired in North Africa and the Middle East, and theories about how things will continue to evolve, I think one thing is crystal clear. What happened is about much more than the internet. People protested because of deep frustrations with political and economic conditions in their lives. The internet didn't demonstrate and march and take risks. People did all of that. And as the Secretary noted, the developments in democracy weren't inspiring because protesters came together and communicated using Twitter or other social media. They were inspiring because people came together and persisted in demanding a better future for themselves. I think it's easy to be misled by all of the numbers surrounding social media, the YouTube hits and Twitter followers, etc. But it's not really about the numbers. It's about the impact of technology and the impact it can have on people's lives and how people can use it as a tool, people who are already determined to make a difference in their own lives. In the end, the Arab Spring wasn't a revolution about technology. Social media, of course, accelerated the Arab Spring. I think made it more powerful, but it didn't create it. Youth unemployment, disaffection with ruling families, high food prices, and other factors, I think, caused dissent movements to emerge. And we believe that countries that attempt to curtail internet freedom by blocking content, intimidating people from expressing their ideas or otherwise putting up walls won't be successful forever. Human ingenuity tends to triumph. And we also think that countries who try to restrict information or repress their people are mortgaging their own futures. They're stifling innovation. And I think that it also encourages government corruption when citizens aren't able to express themselves freely. So what role does the State Department play in all of this, and how do we work to further openness of the internet and connectivity? I think we actually have a really great story to tell there and are working day and night with all of our colleagues from Washington. We're working with all of our colleagues out here in the field, such as our embassy here in Lafayette, to do just that. We're reaching out to nations with breaches of internet freedom through traditional diplomatic channels. Our diplomats raise the cases of imprisoned bloggers and journalists and online activists at the highest levels of government, and we take a public stand on their behalf. In the last year, we publicly raised cases of online activists and journalists in countries ranging from Egypt and Tunisia to Azerbaijan and China and Syria. And we've worked with the Latvian government on issues that we have with Belarus right now in terms of their activity in cracking down on those we think who are expressing themselves freely or trying to express themselves freely. We're developing policy. The Secretary established a net freedom task force to develop a framework for policy planning and implementation of the internet. The Freedom Agenda establishes a strategic direction for the State Department and its efforts. We're developing various programs as part of a program called the 21st Century Statecraft Initiative, which aims to use 21st century tools to meet 21st century challenges. We're also working through multilateral fora. At the upcoming December OSCE ministerial in Vilnius, we're working for consensus that affirms that fundamental freedoms and human rights apply to access to and use of the internet and other digital media. We're expanding our monitoring and reporting. The State Department closely monitors threats to internet freedom worldwide and uses that data to make better policy decisions. We've increased training for our foreign service officers in order to acquaint them with internet freedom issues. And probably, most importantly, we're spreading technology and expertise. We support the development of new technological tools. We've given millions in competitive grants, tens of millions in competitive grants to technologists and activists working on the cutting edge in the fight against internet repression. This involves both technology, enabling users to circumvent controls and break through firewalls, as well as training, helping journalists and civil society leaders and ordinary citizens use tools to get out their messages and protect themselves from security threats. So before we get into questions, I'd like to end with a quotation from Secretary Clinton that I think captures very well our thoughts about the freedom to connect and why it's so important. She mentions, "We want to keep the internet open for the protester using social media to organize a march in Egypt, the college student emailing her family photos of her semester abroad, the lawyer in Vietnam blogging to expose corruption, the teenager in the United States who's bullied and finds words of support online, for the small business owner in Kenya using mobile banking to manage her profits, the philosopher in China reading academic journals for her dissertation, the scientist in Brazil sharing data in real time with colleagues overseas, and the billions and billions of interactions with the internet every single day as people communicate with loved ones, follow the news, do their jobs, and participate in debates shaping their world. I think that shows the breadth of how we see the freedom to connect as having on world affairs, and why we're so firmly behind it, and hope every day to further people's ability to connect in any way they choose. So with that, I'll take a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introductory speech. So now the floor is open for questions and comments. And probably I will take an opportunity as the moderator of the session and to ask the first question while the others are thinking about their topics. You mentioned already that social media has side effects. You mentioned terrorism. You mentioned also probably some kind of gathering of groupings who would like to cause tension or cause some kind of discontent in society. It would be clear, but I think that social media has also negative effects, which doesn't have so threatening probably prospect. Working with social media on a daily basis, what do you see those side effects of social media?
Well, again, I think that the issues that we're concerned about are some of the most serious ones that you mentioned, or that I mentioned, relating to criminality online and things that are real threats to society. But at the same time, obviously there are things on social media that crop up that we might not like, comments that people make that are offensive in some way, but aren't necessarily threatening to security of our society. But as I mentioned, I think that the United States and our philosophy is that the best way to deal with that is through more speech, through open speech, through bringing that kind of opinion to the light of day, as opposed to trying to stifle it in any way. Societies that try to restrict freedom of expression in one way but leave it open in others, I think miss the point that the internet is a whole entity. There's not a social media, social internet, and an economic internet and a political internet. You can't try to shut down one without shutting down the other aspects of it. So those who say, well, we just don't particularly like this speech, so let's see if we can curb, this group or that group from speaking about what they want, are, I think, in the end, hindering their own futures, preventing creativity and innovation online, and that if there are things that people don't like, they can speak out against them, as opposed to trying to shut them down, where that kind of thought tends to fester and grow. So people will sometimes ask us, well, why don't you shut down this group who's speaking out in this way that's offensive to us? That's not the way we go about things. We often will see people say things negative about the United States and what we do. We don't try to prevent people from seeing that information, but we might be out there speaking out against it and saying why we disagree. We think that that's the best way to go about it.
While you are thinking, I have a couple of.
Sure.
Actually, I have a question which I was asked to ask you by one of my PhD students. And he's writing a dissertation on public diplomacy, actually transformation of diplomacy in 21st century. And now we are facing a new phenomenon that in several countries, ambassadors are blogging. So, and still, there is no some kind of unified decision whether it's a good phenomenon or not, because ambassadors are supposed to represent official line of the government. So how far with the blogging ambassador can go?
Well, to begin with, we're always encouraging our people to get out there to be spokespeople, not just ambassadors, but people at lower levels within the government, both in Washington and as well at posts. Certainly there are government policies that U.S. government officials will echo and support, and ambassadors are no different. But at the same time, we give our senior officials a lot of freedom to be able to do and say and interact the way they choose. In fact, we don't put any real restrictions on that because of the fact that it is important for us to have ambassadors and posts around the world who understand what information environments they're in, take the lead on communicating with peoples of those countries. Certainly ambassadors will make decisions about, within an embassy, sort of a general direction and so forth, and there are going to be decisions in terms of what platforms you use and so forth that will be decided there. But the Secretary has been very clear to post around the world that we should encourage our people to get out there, especially those with language skills who are able to connect with populations in their languages, that we shouldn't just have top people who are communicating and only have a few voices or spokespeople. I think we're all really expected to be out there and communicating. The other important point to remember is that it's not really about a one-way street of getting information out. It's really about two-way communication. Social media is so important because it enables us to have a better understanding of what people think around the world, and to have that dialogue. I think that's probably the most fundamental change in the way we do business over the past number of years is that we aren't focused as much on just creating perfect messages that we push out there into environments. We're really about understanding information flows and understanding who's communicating where and trying to be in the discussion around the world. And if you aren't using social media, I think you're really out of the game. But when we talk to our ambassadors about social media, we certainly aren't telling them what to do or how to do it or what to say. A large part of what we say is you're the ones who are going to understand your environments. You understand what's most important in your countries, what people are using, and if you don't know, figure it out so that you can be most effective in getting our messages out there. Well, I think what the world has learned is that people need to be able to express themselves, to have the opportunity to freely associate and assemble, and that there are a lot of complicating factors in environments around the world where people are frustrated and trying to figure out how best to express that anger. Obviously, we try to encourage people to express themselves freely and openly in peaceful ways. And one of the things that we see is that countries that try to restrict sort of speech and assembly and association and stifle people's ability to speak out, are often in trouble, sometimes toppled because that anger spreads and so forth. And that if you are in an environment that's open and people are able to express themselves, you're probably in a better environment to understand what their concerns are and to address them. absolutely. I think, certainly those who are not able to connect because of their conditions in their countries, politically or through economic conditions that don't enable them to have access to 21st century tools, are at a disadvantage going forward. And we do what we can in the U.S. government to help people have those tools to access the internet, whether through development grants or through helping, as I was saying before, spreading technical know-how, working with civil society groups around the world, connecting them with some of our experts to help them better use internet tools, because sometimes it's not even about access to the internet, it's maybe they have access but don't quite know what to do to further their goals using newer tools. So we try to link people up, not just with experts within government, but also through public-private partnerships, people from the outside that we're working with who have the same goals. But of course, as we go forward, that economic development and giving people more opportunities to connect is extremely important. Certainly we're seeing with the development of technologies and cell phones and so forth, you have I don't know how many cell phones are out there now, but I think a couple of billion. So even in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect people to have this technology, we're seeing more of it spread as it gets easier to build into smaller units and gets less expensive. So hopefully that continues going forward. But what we try to do is make sure that we're doing what we can to help further that technology, to expand its access, and to work with citizens in all the countries in which we operate, who want to connect, be able to do so.
My name is Signe. I work here at the University of Latvia. I wanted to ask you, could you name some maybe good examples or case studies where politicians personally engage with the audience, and how do they do it? I mean through social media.
Sure. Well, Secretary Clinton is often out there not only giving speeches live to audiences, but having people be able to connect via the internet and sort of virtual town halls so that they can answer questions. I know that even within our bureau, when she's traveled recently, there's often a component, a social media component involved, where people can send in questions from elsewhere if they're not able to attend an event live, and we'll try to answer them. We're using Twitter and other social media not only to push out information, but to take questions from people. We tweet in 9 different languages, I think, officially right now at the State Department. Obviously, all of our embassies have, I believe all of our embassies have major social media components to their engagement efforts, and have their ambassadors and other high-level officials who are out there talking to populations, using social media and taking questions and providing feedback, and also reaching out to find out what people think about different subjects. I know our Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs earlier this year did a major virtual sort of town hall where she took questions from all over the world about issues at the State Department and how we approach them. So it's really built into everything we do. We don't look at it as something that's separate from our broader public diplomacy and foreign policy work, and know that we're going to reach a lot more people if we're able to connect with them online as well as in person.
My name is Elsa, and I wanted to ask you a question about the Norway case in the summer. Before some time for the tragic events in Norway this summer. The terrorist published his manifest in the social media, and that's why I wanted to ask you whether there is some monitoring mechanisms for security services, and how quickly they work, and if there are some potential threats, what is the reaction, and isn't it somehow opposite to the freedom of expression?
Well, I can't speak directly to all of the intelligence relating to the Norway case, but what I can say, just in general, it sort of goes back to the broader point. Of course, with all rights come responsibilities. You have the right to bear arms, but you don't have the right to go into a public square with a machine gun. We have freedom of expression, but we also have laws that regulate against libel and slander and inciting immediate violence. We believe that freedom of the internet doesn't necessarily mean the ability to commit crimes online, whether spreading child pornography or committing financial fraud, etc. That being said, and every country is going to make its own decision about sort of what crosses that line and what doesn't. But generally, with speech that we see as hateful or something that's disturbing in some way, we're going to try as much as we can to err on the side of openness, err on the side of addressing those kinds of issues by exposing them to the light of day, where, again, we think that they tend to wither, and you have more people coming out and criticizing, those actions. I think a good example was with the case of Terry Jones in the U.S. and his threat of Quran burning, and so a lot of times we would have people ask us, well, why don't you just shut him down? Why don't you say that he can't speak or he can't have an event? We thought that, in the end, while we can condemn people doing this and say why we think it's a terrible idea and why we think it's bad for the U.S. and bad for the world to have somebody come out and do something, we're not generally of the business of trying to shut anybody down from saying what they choose to say, even if we find it offensive. We had lots of people come out and speak against what he was trying to do, people in government, people outside of government, and we actually shared a lot of that with our posts around the world, who were able to spread that to audiences in those countries, to their connection, to their contacts, to show, this is how the United States really feels about this. We, as a country, we don't believe that what he's about to do is a positive thing, and we think that that's more effective than trying to stifle speech.
My name is Carlos, and my question is simple. Internet gives people illusion of animosity, and my question is whether it's a good thing, or should we try to aim to internet where everybody has their real IDs, and where people, not IDs, but where people have real faces and real names, not some anonymous figures, because animosity, in my opinion, it helps enhance negativity.
Well, it's an excellent question. I don't think it's an easy answer to that. I mean, I think that people should be able to use the internet, in ways that they choose, as long as they're not breaking the law. And sometimes people want to be out there and very public, but the internet is also a place where people have private conversations, and maybe in some fora it's appropriate that they're able to speak out anonymously. I mean, certainly in working with people around the world on human rights issues and democracy promotion issues and so forth, or even getting tips in some places on crimes that are about to be committed. That anonymity might be important for people to be able to speak out and feel comfortable doing so. But in other fora, sometimes anonymity might encourage people to say hateful things and be offensive online in a way that having people have to give their identities might not. And companies will make their own decisions about whether somebody to enter a chat forum, for example, has to register and have a real name or not. But I think that it's the internet again is a tool. Social media is a tool, and people have responsibilities to use that tool responsibly.
Hello, my name is Zita, and I wanted to ask you, doesn't social media have too big influence on politics in 21st century? And if this influence is rather positive or negative?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I do think it certainly has an effect on politics and governments around the world. Just on the political side, I mean, if you are somebody who's running for office and you're not using this expansive form of communication, I think you're really hurting yourself. I mean, looking at the United States in the case of the 2008 presidential campaign, you had many people after the fact talking about how brilliant President Obama's internet campaign was, how he connected with so many people at a grassroots level, how many people were able to give small amounts of money, $5, $10, $20 online in a way and more effectively than anybody had used the internet in the past. So, that certainly was a positive effect. And gave, I think, more people a voice in the process. Obviously, politicians, across the United States and I think around the world are seeing how the internet can be effective in terms of getting their message out and building support. But coming back to something I said earlier, I think governments who are not looking at sort of what's happening on the internet, hearing what people say, because it's not, again, just about pumping out information and messages, it's about understanding how people are thinking about things, are really behind the curve and are missing out on a whole host of important data points that could be helpful for them in their ability to govern successfully. And those that are rigid, that are sticking to just old ways of communicating, and not saying that the old ways of communicating and television and radio and speaking in person, they're all important, and social media is just a continuation of the evolution of the freedom of expression. But those who are not using it or don't know how to use it aren't employing people who are, I think, digitally capable, are missing out on a lot of information and tend not to fare as well as those who do.
I have a question. Social media is developing very fast, and also the amount of information there. And so, and as we all know, that negative information has a tendency to become more viral and draw more attention to people than the positive one. Couldn't it lead us to a higher level of public depression?
That sort of gets back to the point of sort of responsibilities of people to act responsibly, and the point that in the end you can't really control what people are putting out there, and that all you can do is try to respond to it if it's something that you think is negative. Yes, things are able to go viral much more quickly, and that's part of the double-edged sword that I was mentioning to start with. While on the one hand it can be used for great good and spreading information quickly and effectively and mobilizing society to act when there are tragedies, or to give money to worthy causes, enabling people to promote their businesses and expand and innovate and so forth. Again, it can spread hate and intolerance more quickly when things are put out there that are irresponsible. It can go viral very fast, and it's very hard to retract. And I think that's something that people as citizens, responsible citizens, we should all be wary of in our own actions when we put things out there. But it's hard to have a tool and only have the positive side and say, well, we're going to try to control the situation and make sure only that the internet's only used for positive things that we all like, and not for anything that we find distasteful. Again, there's that line between distasteful versus illegal, and and countries have to, I think, or should err on the side of making sure that things are open and try to combat things that are illegal online without trying to curtail the freedom of expression or association or assembly, or generally the freedom to connect. But dealing with the things that we find distasteful is kind of part of society, in the same way that there's distasteful things that people say out in the public square, that they say in a park, and in some type of public lecture, on TV, on radio. I don't think social media is any different, and we combat that by going out there if we see things that are untrue or unfair or hateful. Hopefully, when you expose them, when you put them out there for people to see, people will give their own ideas and show why those ideas are wrong. That's the best way to deal with it.
Thank you. I assume we have slowly to wrap up our session because of your program and also students' classes. If I may, I would like to ask you as a last question. You mentioned in your speech that United States now is working on a new initiative which is called the 21st Statecraft Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Could you describe a little bit what kind of initiative it is?
Sure. Well, again, it's trying to make sure that we are using everything that we can, using new technologies to help us in our broader foreign policy efforts. And it can take many different forms. I think one example of it is something we call the virtual foreign service, which has enabled us to go out there and employ as interns, essentially, students from around the country who might not be able to intern actually at the State Department and be able to get their ideas. And a number of them were very helpful, for example, after the Haiti earthquake, in terms of translating material and so forth, as we were doing work there. Also using social media for broader purposes, and using new technology in terms of mobile phones and so forth to act quickly during crises. One example that we often cite is after the Haiti earthquake, we were able to use a lot of great ideas that came in very quickly from mostly young people around the State Department to create the ability to text in the word Haiti to a number and donate automatically to the cause. And within a very short period of time, we had raised over $30 million for relief efforts. By doing that, that's sort of the innovative thinking that we want to have at the State Department in terms of using new technology in ways that we hadn't before to deal with some of our greatest foreign policy challenges. So it's an ongoing process, and I think it's largely a sort of a philosophy to make sure that we're not sticking with just the old ways of doing things, and that we're augmenting them with 21st century tools, and continuing to evolve as social media and other technology is evolving as well.
Thank you very much.